Good morning, everybody. This is Massimo Leone, Director of the Center for Religious Studies of the Bruno Kessler Foundation. Today we have a new seminar in the series on the topics that are at the center of our reflection this year. We are dealing with transformation, conservation, and going back to the topic of the enchantment and disenchantment that has been our topic past year. But intersecting these two streams of reflection, we have the great pleasure to receive a lecture on a very original topic, but absolutely fascinating and crucial one by Andrew Creighton. Let me introduce you formally. So, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today. And let me say that Andrew Creighton is a research fellow at University of Tartu, Estonia. He holds a PhD in semiotics and culture studies from the University of Tartu. Of course, we know University of Tartu in relation with semiotics, cultural semiotics, Yuri Lotman, but also biosemiotics, zoosemiotics, Fonuk and the incredibly interesting research that has been carried on at his university in the past decades. But Andrew Dr. Creighton is also an interdisciplinary scholar working in the fields of semiotics, but also of sociological theory, and with a research focus on meaning and consumption, specifically regarding non-human animals and their experiences within consumer and production settings. He is also an editor with the semiotics journal Hortus Semioticus, which is a very vibrant publication, and is now working on the editing of a volume that is forthcoming, Traces of Extension, which is a collection of perspectives from the social sciences and humanities on extinction and nostalgia. So thank you very much, Dr. Creighton, Andrew, for joining us. Today, you're going to propose a talk entitled Wolves as Enchantment in a Northern Tourist Economy. And I particularly look forward to listening to this talk because, as I said in the beginning, it is at the intersection of two streams of research, one on conservation and transformation, also in relation with environmental issues, that is at the core of our reflection this year, and the other one on enchantment and disenchantment, that has been a trend of research for our center for many months and several activities. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Dr. Creighton, and we'll try now to share his presentation. Dr. Creighton, thank you for joining us.
Thank you kindly, Massimo, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everyone for showing up as well. So, right, presentation, it should be visible. So yes, Wolves as Enchantment in a Northern Economy. This work is largely based off of my PhD work. And just the structure, I will, of course, introduce exactly what I aim to do with this presentation today. Then I'll move on to theory. I was a little bit unsure exactly how familiar this audience would be with the theory, so I hope this is not too redundant for what you already know. Then I'll move on to discuss the context specifically of Thompson, which is a sort of northern economy I will be looking at today, Spiritway Inc., which is a major organizational player, as well as the sort of wolf tourist economy in general. I will then move on to discuss the research, the methods I used, sort of the object of study themes I came up with before doing an analysis. Then I will go on to the more recent work I've done, which is, if you've read the abstract, this will concern Calm Air and its use of wolves as enchantment, which I think is in a sense a break from what I did in my previous research, which I'll get into as we go. So really, I aim here to look at how have wolves been used to create a wolf-based tourism economy and enchant said development in Thompson, Manitoba, Canada. Also, why has this economy faltered? Spiritway Inc., the main player, has gone out of business. There's been some economic issues surrounding a lot of the projects. And also look at Calm Air, which has attempted to contend with such faltering. And I would, although it's pretty early, the issues I'll be talking about regarding Calm Air were from this year, February, March. So it's kind of early to really tell if they've been successful. But from my view, theoretically, it seems to be, they seem to be on the wait. So regarding theory, I'll be talking about McDonaldization, enchantment. This perspective of enchantment is largely drawn from George Ritzer, more dramaturgical and cultural sociological perspectives, and ecosemiotics. So McDonaldization, and I'm sure many of you have heard this perspective before. It comes again from George Ritzer. He first published on this in 1982, but I think most people would be familiar with his 1990, I think 1991 maybe publication, The McDonaldization of Society. And really, you can say McDonaldization is a contemporarization of Max Weber's work on rationalization. In a sense, it's more developed towards a consumer context, where Weber largely took the bureaucracy as the metaphor for rationalization of society, where Ritzer takes the fast food restaurant as the metaphor for how society is rationalizing. And this this really entails increasing predictability, calculability, control, and efficiency within systems, ways of organizing things, even as I argue, thinking and feeling too. However, these systems, while they are quite important for society, they make up a basis of many means of production, consumption, communications, so on. They're quite they're a fundamental pillar, I guess you could say, in contemporary times. They do produce some with sort of an irrational rationality, which tends to be sort of the system over or imploding in itself, in a sense where it begins to defeat its own goals. And this tends to be due to increased being over efficiently, over controlled, over calculated, over predictable, where it has just been made too efficient to actually maintain its original goals. And this is, I guess, quite, in a sense, just a formal rationalization of the system. But these irrational rationalities also extend to things like alienation, boredom, or even more macro issues like environmental destruction, labor violations, and things like that. It could really, in a sense, be anything. And so enchantment, I've taken using, we'll be focusing on two aspects of enchantment here, simulations and implosions. And again, this comes from George Ritzer's work. And regarding the simulation, Ritzer, in a sense, draws this from Jean Baudrillard. He simplifies it a bit, and it really refers to the blurring of the fake and the real. And he argues this is often done with replications. Ritzer, one of his preferred examples is the hotel casino in Las Vegas, where they often attempt to mimic international settings, such as Paris, Egypt, things like that. I've forgotten the names of the casinos, but we all know what we're talking about.
Well, in this context, probably Venice Palace is
Yes,
pretty
Venice.
familiar
Yes,
to us.
thank you, Massimo. Venice Palace is a great example. And yes, so yes, so it's an attempt to sort of reconstruct the experiences, but in Las Vegas. And enchantment, the second aspect of enchantment I'll be looking at is implosion. And this actually, in a sense, originates with Harold Innis and his concept of explosion, where different mediums, he argues, relate to how much empire can expand into time and space. And so for instance, he gives the example of I think Mesopotamia using clay tablets as opposed to use of papyrus, where the empire with using clay tablets is not as centralized as the papyrus empires, because the clay tablets as a medium, they're harder to move around, they're harder to transport, they're in a sense more delicate, as opposed to papyrus, which tends to relate to more centralized empires, because the bureaucracy can be more easily transported, so to speak. Marshall McLuhan, of course, was heavily influenced by Innis, and he took on this concept of implosion, where the new forms of media, radio, television, at least new forms back then, were able to what he calls implode time and space. So time and space, in a sense, retracts, become this global village, and communication is quicker, faster. So the constraints of time and space are removed. And when we get to Baudrillard and Ritzer, they take, and Ritzer draws, he's not so much concerned with Innis McLuhan. He draws more specifically from Baudrillard again. He takes this to a more general understanding where implosions are an erosion of borders between the meanings of once separate things. And he specifically, he gives the example of sort of superstores like Walmart. In Estonia, we have Rimi. Unfortunately, I don't know Estonian or Italian examples. Maybe Elda or Aldi, I think it's called, where these superstores, they implode many different roles that were once quite separate. So, there's a butcher, there's a grocer, you can buy clothes, children's toys, electronics. So they're imploding a number of roles which were once associated with separate businesses. Another example is the cell phone, where once we had a camera, phone, calculator, personal computer, and now these are all imploded into one system, the mobile phone. So then we get on to
sorry, just to check, we still see the first slide of your presentation.
Oh, excuse me. So
I don't know whether you're changing or.
Yes, excuse me.
No problem. No, just because sometimes we have a different perspective. So now we see dramaturgical and cultural sociology. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, yeah. So so maybe I had it in full screen. I don't know if you could see it in full screen. So maybe I'll just leave it like this.
Yeah, leave it. Yeah, now you can navigate and we see the slides. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. No. So as you can see, McDonaldization, it sort of allows for this more social action, in a sense, structural underpinnings and development of contemporary society, especially consumption and consumerism. And then enchantment for Ritzer is sort of the justifications of this development. And for Ritzer, and of course this goes back to Weber. Weber saw this rationalization of society as disenchanting. It, of course, we know this narrative from the Protestant work ethic that as things enchant, we get more scientific, bureaucratic, as we develop laws and so on. Society trends towards this iron cage. And for Ritzer, however, and you can maybe see this a little bit with Weber too, but Ritzer makes it more explicit that there are, in a sense, means of re-enchantment. And this re-enchantment is not this, Jeffrey C. Alexander refers it to as sort of a teleological existentialism. This is not this sort of enchantment where everything is devoted towards the divine, everything in a sense is enchanted, but this is more localized enchantment. Yes, so you can see we have the more structural aspect, the sort of enchanted dynamics, and so I've also included more dramaturgical and cultural perspective, and this is intended to link McDonaldization, enchantment, with more sort of community construction, but also it gives the perspectives, especially as you'll see later, it gives them sort of a means to categorize the dynamics within these perspectives. And this categorization largely comes from Jeffrey C. Alexander's social drama, pragmatics, and so on, which he draws heavily from Emile Durkheim. And for Alexander, actors, and in order to, he argues that ritual has largely been displaced within contemporary societies, and in order to create sort of unified collective representations, consciousness, we need to instead rely on social performance, which is anything from wider political narratives to perhaps what you see on the news and so on. And so he argues that this is constructed through what he calls symbolic, the means of symbolic production. This can be actors, scenes, sets, props. And these all are, in a sense, metaphors for reality. So perhaps to use more contemporary examples, you can say Donald Trump is an actor in the White House is a scene, or wherever there's for instance, the recent floods in Texas, perhaps you can say this acts as a scene in the wider social drama. And props can really be anything that facilitates these scenes. And in order for symbolic, so the actors use these aspects, which includes scripts and narratives and so on, to develop what Alexander refers to as cultural extension. And cultural extension is really just gaining relevance to the wider cultural dynamics of a culture, whether that is more internalized habitual aspects, or this very relevant, or not necessarily relevant, but everyday aspects, new continuously developing aspects. So it's important that that the actor gains this cultural extension to at least one of these things. to get the message across. And when this is when the symbolic production is successful, it creates then collective representations are able to be constructed, and then and this causes what Alexander refers to as refusion, where we again develop these collective emotions, meanings. We develop a collective conscious. In my own work, I've taken Alexander maybe a little bit back to Durkheim and also to Victor Turner, which I think Alexander pulls from quite a bit too, to argue that this social drama in many ways is a form of enchantment, but also it doesn't really, I argue, create a community in every aspect. And a lot of aspects it creates a community, like where I argue that much of this enchantment is very localized. So it does, and so I can't quite create this sort of, so to speak, monoculture that we would associate with cultures from 100 years ago or so on, like that. And of course, this monoculture, it's very idealized. It never existed, but I argue that that societies are still very fractured despite this social drama. And yes, so it has this issue with developing an effervescence consciousness that is truly collective and truly conducive towards a community, outside of a more sort of fractured aspect. Sorry, I was a little muddled. And so finally, we get to the last aspect of the theory, which comes from sociosemiotics, specifically Jakob von Uexküll's Umwelt theory. And Uexküll, in general, argues that non-human animals are subjective. They're agents. They have their own sort of bubbles, understandings of reality, which they understand and manipulate through their effector and perceptor tools and organs, which is used to, or which plays a major role in the development of this subjective reality. So it's very corporeal based. Morten Thompson has also developed on this with the concept of the umwelt map, where although Uexküll touches on this quite a bit, where species' social aspects and its relationship to its environment are also quite paramount to understand the sort of umwelt, to understand more or less, even though it's very ethic view of how a non-human animal relates to reality. And specifically for these purposes, I use this as a means to critique the McDonaldization enchantment, especially when the non-human animal is within these settings. So when we combine these perspectives, we get an understanding of consumer structures and development, the means to study consumer messages, meaning, etc. The positioning of these elements within the confines of community construction, and the means to critique consumption and the associated messages in relation to non-human animals. Before I get to the other aspects, I have been criticized for this perspective. There's three major sort of currents. The first is that it conflates McDonaldization and enchantment, which, and I am guilty of all of these things, all of these criticisms, and however, I am sort of justifying why I'm guilty. And so yes, it conflates McDonaldization and enchantment, especially from Ritzer's perspective. And Ritzer really contends that these are very separate, although they're related, they're very separate phenomenon, where McDonaldization tends to disrupt enchantment, and there's a need to re-enchant, continuously reconstruct re-enchantment, to enchant this McDonaldization. For instance, J. Michael Ryan, who's co-authored with Ritzer, argued that I devalue this or sort of hide this aspect away, which in a sense I do. And this in a part is because I'm trying to argue where that there is actually aspects where McDonaldization and enchantment are for periods of time quite intricately linked and can be in a sense the exact same thing. And this can be seen with enchanting rationalization, where you make a new McDonaldized system that is so sort of new. People are so marveled by this new efficiency, this new control, predictability, or the novelty of it, that it's enchanting. And perhaps maybe for me already, I think this was 10, 15 years ago when I first saw this self-checkout machines, it was sort of enchanting. It was this new technology that seemed very futuristic, very sort of novel. So I remember being enchanted by this. Nowadays, it's just everyday life. It's not really interesting. And this is common aspect of enchanting rationalization, where the enchantment sort of disappears after the initial few interactions with the system. I've also argued that implosion is a part of the rationalization process. As I mentioned, these superstores create these imploded systems where they take a number of different roles and merge them into one. And this isn't just enchantment in that it creates this spectacle of many different sort of means of consuming in one place, but it's also very rational, where it makes consuming more efficient, predictable, controlled, calculable, and so on. And I'm also, in a sense, trying to ground enchantment more thoroughly in rationalization to distinguish from other cultural or social phenomena. And I think this, in part, is because I'm trying to look more specifically at meaning, where Ritzer is more concerned with sort of social action. For instance, when a person, when an animal, for instance, is put into a zoo and gains certain, we can say, rationalized behaviors, to enchant, for instance, maybe you're at a water park and the dolphin is trained to jump and play with the ball and so on. So this, in a sense, is very rationalized behavior, I argue, because it's been trained for this to create this enchantment that is used to justify sort of the consumer rationalization of the water park. But also the dolphin in itself, it's living a very regimented life. So you can see enchantment here is very grounded, but if you look at other aspects of non-human animals exhibiting this similar trained behavior, and well, yes, it may be rationalized, it may not be for the same purposes, and it may not be necessarily more rationalized than it would be in its sort of natural environment, so to speak. And all of these things I need to work on quite a bit, so I don't have any solid answers, and so this very much is an issue with my theory. I've also overemphasized enchantment in everyday life, which I would argue, and this is increasingly because our everyday life is very enchanted, especially as we have smartphones, TikToks, and so on, that allow us to continuously engage with sort of spectacles, simulations, so on. And I've already addressed this to an extent that my umwelten analysis tends to be a little bit sparse. I don't really go into strong detail about the non-human animals, how it experiences its world. And this is largely because I'm not necessarily interested in sort of this more sort of phenomenology of the animal, but I'm more interested in using this to critique social cultural systems of consumption and how they use non-human animals and relate to humans and non-human animals. So I hope that clarifies things. And I'll get into Thompson, Manitoba. I'm a little bit behind, so I'm going to try and go quickly. Thompson, it's part of northern Manitoba, which is Central Province, Prairie Province in Canada. And Thompson is considered the hub of the north of Manitoba, and this is because it's a relatively isolated city containing about 13,000 people. It's at the end, more or less at the end of the highway, and there are some roads out to smaller communities, and many of these communities really don't have any other connections to southern Canada outside of Thompson. So this tends to mean a lot of commerce, shipping goes through this area. And unfortunately, this is not just sort of everyday businessmen, but also relates heavily to drug smuggling, weapon smuggling. And so as a result, Thompson has a very high crime rate. It's portrayed very poorly in the media. It's often sort of considered the murder capital of Canada, the violent crime capital of Canada. And as in many cases where you have these cities with very high crime rates, they're sort of a victim of statistics where, for instance, in Thompson, much of the crime can actually be located in the hotels. So you don't really see this crime. And in a sense, it's even outside of this context, it does have criminal issues, crime issues, but these very specific locations are inflating the sort of this negative perception, the statistics of the city. Unfortunately, it has very high food insecurity. This is because it's in such a northern area. It doesn't really have access to agriculture. All of the food must be shipped in. It's about a 24-hour train trip from Winnipeg, the capital of the region, which is also the biggest city in the region. So in transporting food, it's costly, it takes a long time, and this tends to result in higher prices, which many people just have troubles affording. The city has a large indigenous population, and the surrounding communities are largely indigenous as well. And in these communities, you see actually 90% of children live in poverty. So there's, again, this food insecurity relates heavily to poverty as well. There's heavy drug trafficking, as I already mentioned, and yes, I've already mentioned it's relatively isolated. The city's economy is largely based on mining, which again, in part relates to the poverty. To be a miner, you tend to need about 2 years of a college degree. But also it can be a little fickle where, a mine will be open for 10 years and then it closes. And this depends in part on sort of how much resources the mine contains, but also on the economy and largely how much, in many cases, nickel, the cost of nickel on the markets. So it's an economy that's a little bit difficult to maintain a stable income for a lot of people. So the city, in attempt to do this, has tried to, so a city, in attempting to develop this wolf economy, is looking to rebrand the city while also increase the finances and diversify the city's economy, making a more stable environment for workers. And so they came up with this idea of the wolf capital of the world. In a sense, it's kind of contends exactly with this murder or violent crime capital of the world. This was largely developed through corporation Spiritway Inc., which I believe started in 2008. Unfortunately, it went bankrupt, as well as, and a lot of the local news media has also unfortunately closed down. So I have done a poor job of archiving a lot of that. So although I believe I can find it again, however, it's a little bit difficult to confirm things right now. But yes, so this company was developed to push the Wolf Capital of the World initiative, and it works quite closely with the municipal government of Thompson, as well as the Thompson Zoological Society. And there are many of other players and corporations, individuals, and so on that played a role. But these were, I would say, the main three. So yes, they wanted to rebrand the city based on the charismatic aspects of wolves. And the region arguably has the largest concentration of wolves in the world, with about 4,000 to 5,000 in the province. Yes, I'll just leave it at that. And these are the gray or timber wolf subspecies. And this again wasn't only intended to attract tourists and business, but also academic researchers, and governmental and academic institutions, and to again stabilize the economy and make it more inclusive. However, this in a sense conflicts with Thompson's identity, which is a northern identity, and you see similar identities throughout Canadian northern towns, where it's sort of based in this working class employment, mining, logging, and it's bush pilots, things like this, and it's really technological innovation in this sense. Like as I said, aviation seems to be very important for a lot of these cities' identity, especially as in the early 20th century, this was really the only efficient means to get from one community to the other. So they became quite a lifeline. And the bush pilots themselves, these pilots that would fly from communities, they gained their own sort of mystique of being very sort of innovative, on the fly, excuse the pun, pilots who were at the same time very sort of rugged, gritty, not in a sense civilized, as some people might say. And this really transplants into a lot of identities of northern cities, including Thompson. And you also see there's a strong aspect of the rationalization of nature, where in Thompson itself, it was constructed specifically to house mining workers. So the city is planned city. It was constructed in the 1950s. And a lot of a lot of northern communities, especially ones based on these planned or economic developments, they have a strong aspect of turning nature into sort of social systems, economic systems that are very, again, predictable, controlled, and so on. So this is, again, gaining control of nature is another aspect that you see in a lot of these identities. However, this also conflicts, both of these identities in many ways conflicts with First Nations. In Thompson, it's largely a Cree First Nations populations, which, and of course, it's important not to overgeneralize, but they tend to be less enthusiastic about sort of economic development, controlling nature, and so on. So you see there's these conflicting identities. Getting specifically to the wolf economy, as I said, it was intended to attract tourism, academics, and specialists. regarding tourism more specifically, they intended to emulate the Churchill Manitoba model. And Churchill, when you go from the capital, Winnipeg, it takes about a 48-hour train ride. And so they were hoping to be sort of this stopover area where tourists get off the train, spend a few nights in the city, and go looking for wolves. And in Churchill, you go to Churchill, you pay for tours, and they will take you, and you can see polar bears, beluga whales, maybe narwhals, if it's the right time of year. And so Thompson was hoping to do the same thing, but with wolves. And they developed some tours, as well as a lot of merchandise, like novelty coins, T-shirts, hats, things like that, stickers. They also intended to use this to develop a lot of infrastructure. They proposed a Wolf Research Center where academics, scientists can come and do stays to study wolves. They renovated the Thompson Zoo into what they can now call the Boreal Discovery Center. And this really modernized the zoo, but also specifically for this project, it's included a wolf enclosure, which they claimed is the most sort of innovative wolf enclosure in the world, and it perfectly merges nature with sort of enclosures. So it's a very humane way to hold the wolves. And also you can see this with the Spirit Way pathway, which is really just cutting a path into the woods and lining it with sculptures and art and so on. And it's generally seen as a way to view wolves, but we'll get to that in a little bit. There's also a lot of advertising regarding this. As you can see this picture here, the city developed these wolf sculptures, and each one's painted differently. Some, for instance, there's one that is used to that's in front of the Hydro Manitoba building, which is hydroelectricity. That's painted like a like a telephone pole worker with the hard hat vest. And then you see these are more sort of nature-themed ones. There's wolves that are painted to commemorate indigenous art. So some people paid to paint wolves to commemorate a deceased family member. So each one is different, and these wolves were used as sort of means to promote Thompson, where they were shipped to cities throughout the UK, the USA, Winnipeg, Toronto, and some other major cities where they would be on display in prominent parts of the cities, towns, and sort of promote this image of Thompson as a wolf capital. There were also conferences, although held in Winnipeg, on wolves and carnivores more generally. And there were some festivals and major events. There was a world record where many school children got together and howled like wolves. And this was, I'm not actually sure if they broke it or if it's still available, but it was supposed to be the most people howling as wolves together. And there's festivals often featuring timber and aurora. And these are wolves that, in a sense, have certain popularity in Canada. They were raised by a film crew, and so they're very tamed in a sense. And they would often make appearances at festivals, and people could interact with them. And some local politicians often even referred to Aurora as sort of the mascot of the city. And there was many public art events similar to the statues. There was art constructed outside of, just up on the road into the city. Again, mostly promotional things. So yes, so that was the context of the city. I'll get into the methods. I've largely used qualitative data analysis, for which I'll get into right now, which is analysis of the Thompson citizen. But in the late part, when I'm talking about column error, this was mostly unstructured preliminary work. And I've also, of course, incorporated my own personal experiences and knowledge into these. And as you'll see, theoretical aspects greatly influenced this too. Regarding Thompson's citizen, this paper had started in the 1960s. Unfortunately, it's closed December 2024, so just recently, which is a common trend among many news media throughout northern Canada in small towns. They just cannot maintain sort of the financial flow to remain solvent. It's as a publication, it was pretty sort of matter of fact. It really didn't concern itself with sort of literature reviews, things like that. It was really focused on everyday situations, and it was a publication that covered the Wolf Capital of the World initiative the most out of pretty much any other publication I could find, and really kept up with daily or monthly events, and considered other perspectives from townsfolk, and really kept up with actors, and in a sense was really the only publication that I could see that maintained sort of attempted to keep actors in this development accountable. So it often would criticize corporations or spirit away for using too much money to develop some things, or really anything like that. And from this research, I developed three main themes, which were non-human animal representations, non-human animals in relation to rational systems and the development of rational systems, and humans and non-human animal relations. Just a second, please. And within these, I also developed these through more sub-themes or codes, which were good and bad, especially relating to perspectives of the wolves and development of this economy, commodities, McDonaldization, captivity, unrationalizability, branding, and intersubjectivity. And I won't try to pinpoint these exactly, but I think it's pretty obvious, so it shouldn't be a problem. So in analysis, when I'm specifically looking at McDonaldization, see attempts to rationalize the wolves and the surrounding forest through tourism and municipal infrastructure. The Boreal Discovery Center, as I said, was an attempt to contain wolves, which they were looking to get 3 wolf pups, and they were often considered colloquially as the wolf pack. This was a means to sort of recreate and control nature at the same time. This was very rational in that sense, McDonaldized. And as I already noted, the spirit way, it takes control of this forest. And these northern forests, they tend to be somewhat impassable. They have a lot of insects, a lot of growth. Much forest in Canada, they tend not to be curated. So, if a tree falls down, nobody's going to move it. It stays there. Or, bushes not trimmed back and so on. So it's in a sense pretty impassable if you're just want to go for a walk. And so this path, you can see in a sense it is McDonaldized, where it makes just going into the woods much more predictable, controlled, and calculable, easy in a sense. And you also saw this with attempts to develop infrastructure that would allow more development within Thompson, such as art centers that would focus on things like welding and so on. Yes, and you can also see this with the standardization of the art consumer goods. The wolf statues are all developed in the same way, while they each are painted differently. The general structure is the same. There was, mass-produced T-shirts, as I said, novelty coins, hats, so on. However, you can also see this strong resistance to this McDonaldization. Animal rights activists were very upset about the Boreal Discovery Center. Indigenous perspectives were found it very strange that the wolf was being positioned this way, and a lot of narratives would argue that this was required to maintain the wolf population. But Manitoba and the surrounding regions, there's no issue with the wolf population. They are very healthy. They are not at risk or anything like that. So this was often pointed out, and it was also often pointed out that unfortunately Thompson has a major racial issue, a lot of discrimination against Indigenous people, and so this Wolf Capital of the World initiative was often seen as a means to sort of gloss over these issues and really, again, not face these problems that are really more at the core of the problem than sort of needing a tourist economy. There's a lot of confusion over why this was going on. Many people related more to this mining northern identity than sort of being a wolf city. And also wolf sightings are very rare. Wolves generally do not like to be in areas population dense with people. And yeah, so there was this general issue where the wolves really just weren't participating, so to speak. Tourists would come, spend 3-4 days a week in the city and never see a wolf. Regarding enchantment, you can, from these articles, you saw this strong focus on sort of simulated intersubjectivity or connectivity, which I argue is a denial of the umwelt, but I'll get to that. And you can see this, for instance, with Aurora and Timber, where they were sort of presented as like the friendly wolves, the wolves that are connected with humans. And there was these undertones where, in a sense, all wolves can be sort of intersubjectively interact with. And this was very human perspective. It wasn't really about becoming wolf-like. It was sort of making wolves human-like. Yes, and again, this wolf identity, it was in a sense somewhat contrived, because within this region, within Manitoba, there's many communities within this sort of boreal forest area that the wolves are very dense. And this could be, for instance, seen with the city of Paul, where one year they actually had more wolf sightings than Thompson did. And some Thompson officials argued that this was very emasculating, because they are this wolf capital of the world, but the Paw is getting more wolf sightings than they are. And of course, it makes sense. The Paw's much smaller city, and it's very much in this population dense area for wolves. So this was very sort of strange moment where you can really see this enchantment, this attempt to construct the wolf identity. And again, the Boreal Discovery Center is enchanted as this means to reconstruct nature within a controlled setting, which, and as we'll see later, it really wasn't the case. And and although it was often presented as sort of this new cutting-edge technology, even to a certain extent incorporating like artistic aspects, as you will see, it really was nothing more than a wolf pen. You can also see implosions of human, social, and wolf pack, and human and non-human space, especially within the Boreal Discovery Center, where you see, for instance, the pups were going to be raised by humans, there was no sort of mother or father. The plan was at first to get wolves from the local environment, or to get wolves from a breeder as pups, and then humans would raise them. So there was no sort of natural pack aspects, which I'll get to again as well. And yes, again, the Boyle's Discovery Center, it sort of implied that this was both a human and a wolf space. And you can see this again with the Spirit Way Path, and sort of the city in general was trying to become sort of a home for wolves. And yes, so I argue here that the wolf and the human-wolf relations was attempted to be made as sort of a sacred aspect for the wider community and the tourist economy. Yes, to construct a collective effervescence consciousness through this social drama. And you can see, in a sense, applying this metaphor, the stages could be, again, the city itself, or the Boyle Discovery Center, Spirit Way Path, as well as actors, the wolves, the tourists, Spirit Way Inc., municipal politicians, so on. And the art was a lot of the props, the wolf statues, things like that. And then there was, of course, these narratives about Thompson being the wolf capital of the world, sort of othering the paw to make it seem like Thompson is, the wolf capital of the world instead of one of many. But however, how successful this is questionable. When we look at the cultural extension of this to the wider populations, it largely was inconsiderate of the indigenous population. The wolves did not back this up. The wolves were not appearing, and there is, at nighttime, for instance, there tends to be lots of sightings of wolves with doorbell cameras and so on. But especially during this development, this wasn't really the case. People didn't really use those cameras. And so there was always this sort of underlying issue of there's nobody seeing the wolves. They just aren't materializing. And of course, this also wasn't integrated with the previous identities. And there were attempts, the Spirit Way Path went along some statues that commemorated a bush pilot, for instance, or bush pilots in general. But this was, in a sense, too little. So this really disrupted the refusion, this creation of the collective effervescence consciousness, and the positioning of the totemization of the sacred, of the wolf and human-wolf relations. And this, I would say, definitely happened for locals, but also, I think, in a sense, happened with tourists as well. And you can see this where tourists would show up and often be sort of underwhelmed. And so when we get into umwelt as a critical method, specifically here I looked at the social aspects of the wolf, so this umwelt map. And we can see that this push for intersubjectivity, it really goes against the wolf umwelt. Of course, as I already mentioned, they tend to prefer to be away from human populations. They're in a sense shy. The Boyle Discovery Center, it really did not allow for the development of a pack, of a wolf pack. The packs tend to have, this parents, number of siblings, also some older, non-related wolves involved as well. And a major aspect of wolf social development is going on hunts. And these hunting aspects were really not doable in the Boyle Discovery Center. The center itself, I believe it's claimed to be about 3 acres, allocating this amounts to the wolves, which again is really not enough to sustain a wolf pack and for these hunts. And of course, the caretakers would be the ones feeding and maintaining the wolves. So this really doesn't allow the sort of this merging of nature and culture, so to speak, as the Boreal Discovery Center is often enchanted to be. But really, it's just the confinement and what I would call simulations of the animal. And I developed this in the sense to simulated umwelt, where the animals are structured by rational systems, whether this is to representations to justify these systems, or it's corporeal changes to the body, behavioral changes, communicative changes, and so on. And you can see this especially with behavioral, communicative, and experience, where the wolves, again, they would not be able to develop this social wolf pack. They wouldn't be able to communicate in similar ways. They just wouldn't develop the experience and the skills necessary to do these things, to hunt and so on, because it just wasn't available. It wouldn't be available to them as animals held in the Boreal Discovery Center. And to this day, nobody has been able to get wolves into the Boreal Discovery Center. So it's still planned to happen, but it's been about, I think, 15 years. So a lot of people don't believe it will actually ever happen. But the center is still arguing that it will. But also, you see, in general, the community had a better awareness of the wolf umwelt. They understood that, you're not really going to see wolves. Some people, they live in the city their entire life and they only see a wolf once or twice. And so in a sense, you can see this was very hyper-enchanted or hyper-real, where there was a narrative being constructed, but nobody really believed it, but it was being sort of forced and pushed out, and it didn't really take because of that. So in conclusion, for this aspect, wolves as the totem wolves were attempted to be made as a totem for the wolf economy. And this would have, I would argue, create sort of a community-like creation instead of a community, because it was just wasn't encompassing enough to create a real community. And again, through the simulations, implosions, largely of intersubjectivity in space between humans and wolves. This, of course, was a method that was used quite frequently to develop this enchantment of the economy. But again, there was the wolves are unrationalizable. The community was resistant to these narratives, and this, in a sense, made it much more hyper-real. The wolves and the narratives as hyper-representations, which, did not conform with knowledge or identities of the locals regarding wolf behavior. So this really made it difficult to maintain local interests as well as an identity as a tourist destination. And now, some years later, Spirit Way Inc. gone bankrupt. It's no longer in operation. However, the economy is still there still is an aspect of the wolf economy which is quite strong. The Spirit Way path is still there. The artwork is still there. The identity is still, this wolf economy and identity is still holding on to an extent, but I would argue it's, at least seemingly from what I've seen, it's decentralized. The Spirit Way Inc. is no longer there coordinating, getting the government funds, advocating for the city in the same way that it used to. And so now different organizations are sort of doing this, but it tends to be more localized individual means. So Spirit Way tried to advocate for basically the entire community, the companies, governments, and so on. Where now you don't really see this. You don't have an organization that is doing everything for everyone, so to speak. The municipal government to an extent, but it's not the same priority. And so one company that I found very interesting and is really taking up the mantle, although largely for itself, but it's incorporating many other local businesses and so on, is Calm Air International LP. It's a regional airline serving Manitoba and Nunavut, which is the territory above Manitoba. And they're offering a vacation package called Howling with Wolves in Thompson. And it's focused in the Thompson region. And of course, wolves. And this package actually, from its first, from what I understand, it might have, they might have had a trial in 2004, but the advertising for it was, I believe, March and April, or February and March of this year, 2025. And what I found very interesting about this package is that it addresses many of the issues above, where it contends with sort of indigenous identities, especially, and with sort of an inability to construct a community, excuse me, I'm forgetting the third. Oh yes, and it's also, I would argue, deals very well with this sort of the elusiveness of wolves. Sorry, I don't know why this is, I deleted it by mistake. And this is, these are direct quotes from the pamphlets. There is no other animal as mysterious as the wolf. And so right away they sort of position the wolf as not being sort of something you can interact with, but it's very mysterious. It's so they enchant the wolf, or they use this aspect of the wolf to sort of enchant their this package. Instead of seeing a wolf, interacting with a wolf, it's very face to face. It's more mysterious. It's sort of maybe in a sense almost like a ghost tour. They also rely heavily on indigenous partners too, and they have this disclaimer that they've developed this with indigenous partners, Cree Nation. Yes, and then yes, you spend a week with this sort of polarized creature, which again, it sort of gives this mystique to the wolf as being, some people hate it, some people love it. And then when you get into these more activities, one of the major aspects of the trip is that you are taught to how like a wolf. So you call out, and they argue that maybe the wolf will communicate with you or talk back. You also participate in indigenous teachings on the wolf. And this was very interesting. You go on a dog sled with Canadian Huskies. I'll get into this a bit, and they say one of the closest dogs to the wolf, which is, as you'll see, it's a very interesting thing to say. When you look at the schedule, again, you see a lot. It's very intensive. You arrive 10 a.m., and then an hour later, you're already speaking with tribal services, cultural advisors, land guardians. It's very sort of intense cultural experience from very respected, I don't want to say authorities, but members of Cree culture, local culture. You go for a Thai dinner. Again, you trying to howl like wolves. You participate in indigenous storytelling and wolf tours. And of course, there's a lot of breakfasts, lunch, and more physical activities. Dog sledding, excuse me, as snowmobile activities and so on, snowshoeing. And then, yes, you see again more tours, more experiences with indigenous elders and culture, and sweat lodges, which sweat lodge is very interesting because it tends to be very exclusive to it tends to be an activity that's very sacred. And for instance, I grew up in Winnipeg, and I would never even imagine that I would be allowed in a sweat lodge because I am not Ojibwe or Indigenous Métis. So I found it a little interesting that they had this very sacred activity for tourists. And yes, and more dog sledding. So this, again, as I said, was very interesting, and especially, for instance, this Thai dinner, which I found was an aspect that's contended with sort of not many people would like Northern Canadian food, especially this more sort of bush meat, where if I was going on this tour, I would expect to be eating a muskrat or moose, animals like that, which I think a lot of people have a lot of reservations about eating. So that was just a side thing that I found interesting, that maybe in many ways they had to curtail local culture and cuisine. But regarding the Canadian Huskies, I found this actually really a strange term, because I would never call them Canadian Huskies. I would call them Inuit sled dogs, or Kimik or Kilmik, which is Inuit for the dog. And Inuit culture maintains that these are half wolf dogs, so that or they're sort of a mixture of wolves and dogs, and they're fantastic sled dogs. But genetically, there have been scientific tests on these dogs, and they don't seem to be any more wolf-like than the average dog. And so I feel, in a sense, so you cannot say that it's half dog. I think from perspective of Canadian advertising laws, it's considered false advertising. But everybody knows. Like I see Kimik, and they say, oh, it's the half wolf dog, and they have this sort of perception or representation as being wolf dogs, and so everybody knows this. And so in here you can see this sort of acting as a surrogate in place of the wolf. So you cannot interact with wolves, you cannot pet wolves, and Kimiks are very social, they're very talkative, so they're very interactive. So you can't interact with the wolves, but you can interact with the wolf dog. And again, this plays very well with the wolves being elusive and framing them as mysterious to be learned about, howling with the wolves instead of seeing them. So this ensures that the wolf's position as an actor is maintained. So this was one of the biggest issues for the construction of, or the refusion of collective representations, was that the wolves just weren't there. But this sidesteps that issue, and it creates sorts of a duality, or at least a dynamic between, again, this intersubjectivity, assimilated intersubjectivity, and this implosion of wolf-human intersubjectivity, with this more mysterious aspect where the wolves are hard to pin down. So you can still communicate with them, but it's as this other layer that this other dynamic of the wolf as being harder to communicate with, to interact with. And then again, yes, you see the strong indigenous aspect, and again you see a certain dynamic here where most tourists, unfortunately even from Canada, would see this as very sort of mysterious, maybe even mystical or exotic experience to be participating in these teachings with Cree authorities and so on, and learning about these narratives. But it also draws from a real community. People, these values about the wolves, stories about the wolves, narratives and stuff, they're very important to a lot of people in around Thompson region, especially indigenous people. And this, you do not need to construct an identity. The identity is already there. And it temporarily integrates the tourists. I argue this tour into these narratives by immersing them, again, with so many experiences within 3 days with indigenous elders, guides, so on. But also these tour groups are relatively small. So in a sense, they're isolated from the larger communities. They're going on these continuous physical and environmental experiences. They're eating together for, sometimes 9, 10 to 8 at night. And a small group dynamic, which all, I would argue, is conducive for sort of creating a much stronger experience of community. I would still say it's community-like, because at the end of the day, on the 3rd day, you get on the plane and you leave. And maybe you never talk to the majority of the people again. But for that moment, I would argue it gives these similar emotional and experiences and sort of understandings as being in a community. So in conclusion, as I already more or less noticed or mentioned, Calmer embraces this reinterpretation of the wolf, and this really allows it to contend with a lot of the issues that the wolf economy and Spirit Way Inc. and so on couldn't really deal with. Also does this through focusing on First Nations perspectives, while integrating this with very intensive days, short duration, small groups, etc. So thank you. Yes. I'm sorry this maybe went a little too long.
Well, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I was really impressed by the depth of your research, the detail of your research, but also your capacity to connect these micro-analysis with broad issues and central themes in the study of present-day societies and the interaction between human beings and non-human or other than human or more than human animals. Terminology is constantly switching.